Great, well, thanks. This is a fabulous turnout. I'm so glad you're all here, online and in person. My name's Max, and I'm a climate nerd, amateur, passionate community organizer, Friends of Cortes Island Society board member. Probably lots of other things. And I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered here today on the traditional territory of the Tla'ahu's, Tla'amin, and Homalco. And we recently had Truth and Reconciliation Day. And I always think a lot about climate change when I think about reconciliation. Because for me, it's hard for me to imagine actually having reconciliation without actually doing what's required of us on climate. And so for me, they're very closely connected. And we just have Mark Vanesh joining us in the room. Hi, Mark. Thanks, our regional director. And I would like to invite Christine, our guest from Vancouver, to introduce herself and a bit about your background, if you don't mind, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Hi everyone, thanks Max for inviting me to join you folks. Pretty excited about this presentation, in part because I really enjoy spending time in your part of the world. I know I'm not very far away, but it can feel like a world away when I'm visiting in those places. And also in part because it's not often that I actually get to do a longer format of this workshop. So I really appreciate that that Max kind of had set it up as a 2-hour session so that we could get more in depth into various discussions. But yeah, my background, I currently study in the climate research lab at Simon Fraser University. I'm doing a master's there, and I am specifically looking at the water cycle impacts of carbon dioxide removal. So one of the ways to mitigate against climate change. And I am a former board member of the Sierra Club of BC, so I definitely really appreciate the work that is being done by nonprofits to kind of expedite climate action, but also conservation work. And I could also say that in addition to being a climate ambassador for an organization that's based out of MIT called Climate Interactive, which is the organization that created the En-ROADS model, which I'll be doing a demo of with you all, and which I know some of you, at least one of you on the call, is training to use as well. So you feel free to fill in some of your learnings as well. So as we go through the simulation later, I could say that I kind of got my start in having a concern for even knowing about climate change when I was a student at UBC many years ago, and was just browsing through the stacks to do a research paper, and came across a book that was not even related to anything to do with the class I was taking, but it was on environmental economics. And it just really talked about 3 major environmental issues and the kind of potential economic impacts that they could have in the future. And one of those issues was climate change. And I found it very persuasive, and I just kept trying to learn more about it. And so that is kind of what brings me here today, and kind of like this continued interest and continued motivation to try to find ways to help kind of reduce the impacts of climate change.
So, thanks, Christine. And I think we talked about inviting Mark to share a bit of an update on some of the climate stuff, and maybe doing that sooner in case people trickle out as we get deeper and deeper into our workshop part.
Sure.
Do you want to do that, Mark?
Sure. Thanks, Max. Thanks, Max, I sometimes joke around and call Max the climate czar for Cortes, because he's just so focused and so unrelenting in addressing this issue, which is I really important. So I just appreciate your efforts,
Thank you.
pushing us all. Yeah, the SRD, you know, I'm into my second year, representing Cortes and Strathcona Regional District. And, I guess there's kind of a couple of things that we've done or managed to push through. One is getting, reducing our carbon footprint as part of our strategic priorities at the regional district. So for the first time in history, that's one of our strategic priorities. And that's in the delivery of Strathcona Regional District services. So it's, you know, it's not that broad of a mandate, but it's a step forward. And it was a push to get it on, and it took a lot of passion and strong words. Robin Mowini from Quadra Island was another advocate and helping get that through as well. So that's one thing we've been able to do. And then the other thing that we're just starting right now is everybody's familiar with the wood, or everybody on Cortes who's on this call is familiar with the wood chipping service that has happened as a way for people to fire smart their properties. So this is a grant that's come from the provincial government that basically allows people to pull their wood out of their properties, make it more fire smart, and then the SRD pays for them to be chipped and for the chips to be removed. And that grant is limited, and people notice we're not getting it this year because that grant is being stretched across the whole regional district. But what I've been hearing is that people really appreciate that service. They think it's really important, and there's more and more awareness around people fire smarting their property as the risk of wildfire increases. So what we're looking at doing is creating a new service, a climate resiliency service that wood chipping would be part of. So it's sort of the home for it. That grant would be received there, but then it would allow us to do other climate resiliency projects. And the idea is to keep it quite broad, so that it could be education, it could be specific things addressing our carbon footprint on the island. And we're looking at creating a sub-regional service. So between Quadra and the Discovery Islands and Cortes. So which is really nice. It means that Robin and I, or the two directors from Quadra and Cortes, would be the ones voting on it. It's not those decisions wouldn't be decided by the whole board. So it gives us some leeway as to the decision-making power there. And like all services, it's something that will come back to the community for approval. So it's not just something I can do. So there'll be a alternative approval process or a referendum to get this in place. But I'm really excited about this because I think, you know, there's lots of pressure, I think, for people to look at their own carbon footprint and do things personally, but what can government do as far as putting dollars towards projects that are going to make a difference, whether that's in transportation or education or projects that are specifically going to decrease our carbon footprint. And the last thing I'll just talk about it, I think what my experience in government is that there's a large appetite for climate mitigation projects. So these are projects that are dealing with rising seawaters and fire. It seems like all political stripes can get behind these kind of projects. So, which is great because we need that and it's part of dealing with climate change. And what I'm trying to do, and I think, you know, is to sort of latch onto this appetite. People are aware that climate change is happening, and they're, you know, the vast majority of people know what's happening and know we need to prepare for it and deal with it. And fold into that mitigation the idea that we actually need to deal with the root cause of it, which causes the problem. So that's kind of where I'm sitting as the elected representative right now. And you know, I think that one of the big things that's I guess one more thing is waste. I sit on the waste management board for the Strathcona Regional, Strathcona and Comox waste management board. And one of the things I learned being on this board is that the organic waste that goes into our landfills is a huge contributor to methane, which is way worse than carbon dioxide as far as greenhouse gas emissions go. And the landfill in Campbell River just got capped, and it was releasing 50,000 tons a year of methane. And we just started flaring it. And flaring it means all you're doing is basically just burning the methane, and it reduces, and it basically turns methane into carbon dioxide, which is still not great, but it's way better. And it reduces the greenhouse gas emissions by 25,000 tons per year. So I think there are some you know, people just think, oh, I need to like drive less as far as climate change goes, but there's some things that are actually make sense economically and have a big impact, like waste, and the organics in our waste that can have a big difference too. So I'm really interested in sort of the broader picture of things and the sort of new ideas and ways that people can easily get behind. I don't know, Max, am I missing anything you guys should be talking about?
No, I think that's super great. I think setting up some of the governmental infrastructure where we can start to tackle these things is super awesome, and really grateful. A lot of us struggle to want to get off of this rock and interact with the world of government, and so thank you for being our champion doing that, and that's some really good stuff. I think it's a really great segue also to talk about like your process of learning the role that landfill gases have, because probably lots of people are not aware of that and what a big thing it is, and one of the things that Christine's gonna like kind of walk us through and that the simulator helps to bring out is like, what are these things that we're not aware of that are actually really big pieces that we can't address alone in our homes, and that we can only address together at the level of government. So that's a really super example.
Nice. One last thing on waste is that Cortes is one of the worst areas in the Strathcona Regional District. I think the worst place for the amount of organics in our waste. Yeah. Which kind of surprised me. I think that's partly because we're a big tourist community, and I think tourism accommodation doesn't necessarily have composting as part of their the service that they provide people. But it really shows an opportunity that you know, education, people learning how to compost, and people understanding the impact of putting compost and organics into the waste system is a huge detriment to our greenhouse gas emissions.
Nice one. Christine,
Just a quick question to Mark.
question.
Oh, sorry, you're busy.
Yeah.
Just public transportation, is that an issue?
Yeah, that's
like Gertie, like the.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a really good point. Transportation as well. We're all driving around in vehicles by ourselves. And because we're a small island, there have been challenges of how do we create some sort of system that, you know, makes sense economically, but also, you know, allows people to pool our resources and share some transportation. So the Cortes Economic Development Agency, led by Kate Madigan, has working with SADU, and they're coming up with some transportation pilot projects that we're hoping to pilot. And I just supported a motion at the SRD 2 weeks ago, putting $50,000 of our gas tax money towards a grant application that, so that $50,000 would cover 50% of the cost, and raise $100,000 to do a active transportation plan for Cortes. So we can really figure out the ways that we can make walking and biking more accessible and usable by people. So I think transportation has two sides. One is the active transportation, making our roads safer for bikers and alternative transportation, but also looking at ways that we can pool our resources and you know, have a van or some kind of transportation that allows us to, I think at least get to Campbell River. That would be great. If people didn't have to take their vehicles across every time, get across Campbell River and be able to do their work there.
That's super awesome.
Okay.
Cool.
Any questions from the online world before we jump into some slides?
Can I just make one quick comment? Because I'd love to at some point exchange the experiences on Cortes compared to Main Island, where I spend my weekends, whatever, but that's not for this evening, but sometime.
That sounds fun.
That's great. Thanks for joining us, Jeanette.
Yeah.
Are you on Cortes, Jen? Are you between Cortes and Maine?
I'm in Coquitlam right now. That's my other part-time.
Okay.
So not Cortes.
All right.
I've actually been to Cortes someday.
Oh, do come.
Cool. Christine, you want to take us through some slides and get that part of things rolling? Oh, you're gonna have to unmute them.
Gosh, okay, thanks, Max.
First one.
Shall I share my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right. Let's see here. Okay, so welcome. And I should acknowledge also that I'm coming to you all from the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Quiquitlam nations. And I'm just going to give you a few overviews to start, because Max and I talked about hitting on a few different themes in this workshop. So one is the larger backdrop of climate change, and then the others are wildfires and agriculture, just as being two things that many of us are pretty aware of being impacted by climate change in our respective regions. So first, a little bit of an overview of the state of climate in terms of atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, how the global emissions of carbon dioxide break down by source, as well as annual greenhouse gas emissions by greenhouse gas, and global temperature change from pre-industrial times, so around 1850. All right, so on this graph, we are looking at a pretty long period of time. So we're going back in time almost 1 million years here. And we're looking at the carbon dioxide concentrations in parts per million. So we've probably all heard of the organization 350.org, and perhaps aware that our current carbon dioxide concentration is, I think I even saw it in one of Mac's slides, certainly in the 400s parts per million now. But we can see from this graph that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere obviously fluctuates over time. It's not that it's constant, but it's kind of tends to stay within a certain range over the past 800,000 years. And that range is one that, you know, our human kind of systems and structures have kind of developed within, but also, you know, the life forms that we're familiar with have kind of thrived within. And since about 1950, we can see that because this is such a lengthy period of time, it looks like the emissions have just shot straight up over the past 75 years or so. And you can see that this is kind of an unprecedented level of carbon dioxide to be in the atmosphere, you know, kind of looking back over many hundreds of or thousands of years. And so where has this carbon dioxide come from? Well, it's come from primarily from the use or the emission of greenhouse gases from the consumption of various fossil fuels that have kind of the consumption of which have crept up significantly since 1950. And then also you can see in this beige layer overlying the coal, the oil, the gas, and other fossil fuels is land use change. So that would be things like shifting forests to agricultural land, but also other types of land use change as well. In terms of total annual greenhouse gas emissions by gas, you can see in this figure, and again, it starts from pre-industrial time, or kind of it starts at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, so 1850 or so, and it shows greenhouse gas emissions in gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. So that's kind of we'll be using that measure later in our simulation. Will be like how many gigatons do we want to strive to reduce our emissions by? And here you can see that the again, if we're starting to look at around 1950 or so, you can see that these emissions start to take off significantly. And the one that increases, you know, most dramatically here is the carbon dioxide from fossil fuels. You have carbon dioxide from land use and forestry, some methane, which just mentioned as a very powerful greenhouse gas that has also, increased not by the same measure as carbon dioxide from fossil fuels, but still has increased. And then dinitrogen oxide, I guess you could say, and then F gases like CFCs and others that are kind of often used as refrigerants have kind of, I guess they've started to exist since the last century. So those have increased a bit too. In terms of how global temperature has trended with these, so I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with how greenhouse gases work, but I'll just kind of recap very, very briefly. Basically, the more greenhouse gas that is in the atmosphere, the more heat gets trapped within the atmosphere. And so as we've had a dramatic increase in greenhouse gases, we've also started to see kind of a sharp uptick in the global average temperature. And so here you can see a couple of different data sets that are being used, and they're in pretty good agreement. One's from NASA and the other is from the Met Office, and that's in the UK. And yeah, you can see that, even as of 2010 or so, we would have, here's a temperature anomaly. So the difference from what existed previously to in 1850, say, or like a average of years from around that time period to now. So we see an increase of under 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is probably a figure that you've been seeing in more recent news reports as well. So a little bit of that was the overview of the kind of the state of the climate. Here's a little overview of climate and food security. So just to put things in perspective, and folks can have the access to the slides later if in case you want to check out some of the links and background information. But in BC, we import billions of dollars in food, and it represents over 50% of the food we consume. Just as an example, we're aware that large portions of those imports are from California, and California itself is expected to have significant climate change that will impact the amount of food that can be exported. And some of that may come from drier conditions, but actually some of it will also come from changing rain patterns, and some patterns receiving too much rain and expected to receive too much rain in the future, to the point where they won't be suitable for growing the crops that are currently grown there. So it's kind of like, it can often be related to increased drought, but in some cases, the increases in flooding can also cause those changes in food availability, or the ability to grow food in the first place. And then our Canadian food system has been found to be vulnerable to climate change. It could, for example, reduce our food security, reduce our access to nutritious food, and also potentially increase foodborne illness. And in terms of climate change's impact on wildfires, I'll focus specifically on BC in a moment, but I just wanted to mention something just in terms of terminology. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change often provides guidelines to how people should be talking about different climate change impacts. And one word that can be overused is the word risk. And so when talking about wildfires, I just wanted to make sure to be really clear. The guidance is that climate change increases the probability that wildfires will occur in certain places where certain factors are kind of lending themselves more and more to increase wildfire. But risk is specifically applied when those wildfires threaten ecosystems or human populations. So in terms of climate change impacts on wildfire probability in BC, although they are closely related to the risks because there are people living in all these areas. This figure shows, and it's from a pretty recent study, focused on wildfire in BC and how it has increased significantly from 2000 or so to now. The picture looks a little different when you kind of try to look into the future. Well, it's not predicting the future, but they're projections on what is potentially likely to happen. When you look at central BC versus coastal BC and northern BC. And so what you're seeing, obviously, in the, or maybe not obviously, in the gray portion of the chart, so on the left of each of these panels, is the historical data. And this would be from a variety of models. So the dark gray line will be the average of the various models that were used in this study. And the wider gray band shows kind of the range that these models would have found. And then you see kind of something similar on the right side of each of these panels, which is these colored bands. And so, and then if you look at the bottom of the screen, and I'm not sure like how big it is in terms of folks who are viewing in person, or folks who are looking at your computer, you might have to look quite closely. You'll see something that says SSP 245, SSP 370, and SSP 585. We'll talk a little bit about SSPs later, just in case that's something a little bit unfamiliar to folks, but it's basically different climate change scenarios. So SSP 2 is kind of like a not super sustainable, but kind of sustainable trajectory. SSP 3 is kind of a world at odds where there's not a lot of cooperation happening, and we're not making a whole lot of progress. SSP 5 is sometimes called a business as usual scenario, or just one in which really kind of folks are kind of working against each other at counter purposes, and emissions are highest in that scenario compared to the other two. And so in each of these, you can see that the average daily temperature goes up, but in coastal BC, for example, so this would be the middle panel in the left column, the temperature, average daily temperature goes up least compared to the other regions. And the climatic moisture deficit also is lowest, is second lowest in coastal BC. And the temperature and the moisture deficits are two things that play into the potential for wildfires to increase. So we'll also talk about towards the end of the workshop possible risk mitigation responses in light of what we'll see, that even if we do really well to mitigate against climate change, there'll still be some increase in average daily temperature and moisture deficit. So how do we kind of deal with that? It sounds like on Cortes you're already finding ways to deal with some of these things. And just to give you a little sneak preview of the model that I'd like to use with you. So it's called En-ROADS, and it was developed by Climate Interactive, which is based out of MIT's Management and Sustainability Initiative. And I'm going to go to a live version of the model because I just want to show you quickly how this works. There's there's actually 6 major policy areas related to energy supply, transportation, buildings and industry, population and economic growth, carbon dioxide removal, and other sources of greenhouse gases. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to play around with these dials, and we're going to see if we implement policies and different measures, how they impact the mix of emissions that are happening to the end of the century, and also how that impacts the global average temperature increase by the end of the century. And so I guess one other thing that I'll mention now is that obviously we're in BC, we're thinking about our BC context. This model applies to the global picture. So we're gonna be always making a little bit of a leap of imagination. So if we're thinking about the policies we want to implement in BC, if the whole world implemented them in this type of measure, this type of mix, what would be the outcome? So obviously we can make change here, but it's going to be the combined change made around the world that will give the ultimate result that we will see later on. And so now I believe I am going to hand this over to Max, and he's going to talk to you a bit about the concept of a fair share of emissions targets.
That's right. Gonna do my best. Okay. Working? Okay, so yeah, the piece that I'm contributing here is my experience of grappling with this problem and where I've spent most of my time thinking and reading is, you know, how bad is it? How are we doing? And you know, who is actually making sense on this issue? Who's talking about things that are firmly tied to the science? And so for that, I have you know, looked at a few authoritative sources and looked at some of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so I'm just gonna walk you through sort of like the things that I've looked at that I think are the most important for deciding, you know, who's making sense and who has decent and good plans, and how far, ultimately, how fast do we need to move to get this problem under control-ish, as best as we can from where we are now. Yeah, and it helps me also determine like, how hard do I need to work on this? How hard do we need to work on this? And so I want you to join me in that experience. That's that slide. Oh, it's slow. How do you go backwards? Hang on, I'm new here. Yeah. So yeah, it's bad, it's urgent. We just had a slow computer.
Max, can you hide the picture that, well, no, I mean, it's covering your slide. So.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's right. We can do like,
Yeah, that's good.
so I want you to know that we have a lot of work to do. We need to increase our ambition quite a lot, and more of us are needed to make that happen. And I want you to see how many of us are here together and that we're not alone. And Christine is gonna help us see that we have a lot of options, a lot of solutions, and when we add them together, we can make some real progress. And I want you to feel confident when you go out into the world and maybe can determine who's making sense and who's not making sense. And I want all of us to wrestle a little bit with complexity. This isn't a silver bullet problem, and a lot of people make nice sounds in relation to this issue without actually offering something that gets us to where we need to go. And that is a complex assessment to make. And so very briefly, we know what, you know, 1.1 or 1.2 feels like, because we've seen it here. We've had our gasoline rationed. We had 2021 was really dramatic in BC, with a bunch of farm animals lost. lots of smoke around the world from Canada, Canadian wildfires. 90% loss of fruit this winter was pretty dramatic. We're spending a lot of money in this province alone recovering from these impacts. Yeah. Estimated cost to BC 3 to 5% of provincial GDP. Like this is a really big deal, and we're at 1.2. And Barry Saxifrage contributed a lot of what I think and know about this. Globally, also plenty of bad news already at 1.2. We know 1.2 is very bad, and we want to try to limit warming as much as we can. We don't want things to get warm, and they will continue to get warmer until we get to zero emissions. Yeah. So the question is, how much warming can we handle? And this has been thought about and determined by lots of smart people and decided in a fairly democratic way at the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and negotiations between countries. And we decided at the Paris Agreement in 2015 that limiting warming to well below 2 degrees and to aim for 1.5 degrees Celsius, that is what everybody has agreed to. That is what all levels of government talk about when they talk about setting their climate targets. Those goals have been decided by the national level of governments, but our provincial government and provincial governments across this nation also refer to that. They know that they're fitting into that. They know that that's the target, that's the guideline for limiting warming. So we don't need to worry too much about like, oh, well, what if 3 degrees is maybe not so bad? What if that's a sweet spot? I mean, yeah, people argue about that still, but as far as I'm concerned, and to the extent that I've done homework on this, that settles it for me. We decided, and that's what we all claim to be aiming for. And so with that, it's still risky. 1.5 is not good. 2 is a lot worse. But it's what we agreed on, and it's what I'm working with. 1.5 is also extremely ambitious, but necessary. 2 is also still very ambitious and necessary. And yeah, just briefly flagging that every time we look at what the impacts are at 1.5 and 2 degrees, it looks a little bit worse. So AR6 and AR5 are a couple of versions of the science that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change puts out. And they produce, this is sort of the most recent graphic from the 6th assessment report. That's what AR6 is. And so you can see that we have red is high risk, yellow is like medium risk, still bad. So we've been experiencing down here, like any extreme weather that you've seen in the news or something, we're like in this orange band right here. So impacts in BC that we're feeling, that's what we're getting at 1.1 or 1.2 of recent warming. And so you can see that we get into some red at 1.5 already. So it's a warming target that is not super great, still in for some hurt, but as we get up to 2, it gets more extreme, and beyond 2, it's worse than that. And so those great global scientists who studied this problem have determined for us how much pollution results in how much warming. And so this is, you can see that we're working backwards from how much warming can we handle, how much pollution leads to how much warming, and this process has helped me figure out how fast, how far. So this here, is our global carbon budget as it's known. So 275 gigatons or billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions. This temporarily excludes the other gases that Christine told us about.
So
And
is that, sorry, is that annual emissions or total cumulative
total cumulative emissions.
in the atmosphere? Okay.
Yeah. And so one of Christine's slides talked about how much annual emissions are.
Right.
62-ish
Right, sorry,
gigatons
yeah.
right now.
Right.
Yeah. And so, you could do the math for yourself and see how many times does 62 fit into 275. I think I'm probably gonna get there.
Yeah.
And that's for a 50-50 chance of staying at 1.5. So not the best odds, but it's sort of a number that people use. There's some amount of uncertainty around these numbers, so we get a range. This is our carbon budget. Oh, I said 62. I was wrong. I have 36.8 gigatons here. And so this figure is already 10 months old, and so doing the math, breaking the annual down to monthly, it's already down to 244 gigatons left in our budget. You can already get a sense of how fast we're burning through this budget, which gives us a sense of how fast we need to be moving.
Oh, so, sorry, just want to parse this so I understand.
Sure.
It's not how much can be in the atmosphere, it's how much we can contribute before we are past the point of no return,
That's right.
kind of.
Yeah, this is not,
It's a decreasing number, it's kind of every year that number goes down if you don't turn it around.
yeah, like
Okay,
people sometimes call it pollution space remaining. How much room do we have in the atmosphere for our pollution? But it's different than like a parts per million
sure,
concentration.
right,
And it includes like the ocean takes up some of our emissions
yeah,
and stuff like
okay.
that.
thanks.
Good, happy for questions. I think that's great. If I'm going too fast or too slow or,
BAU,
business as usual.
oh, yeah, okay.
And yeah, so this is just to say that this is not like a safe budget. This is conservative, which people use in a very weird way, in my opinion, where it's conservative in favor of the business as usual economic growth, sort of wealthy world model that we have in our worldview. I would prefer to use the term conservative in the sense of like, let's be really careful about how we treat our planetary systems and be conservative about safety. But so this budget is already leaning in the direction of like risk. And there's some things that are left out of this, like feedbacks from the system, which is where, you know, like Canadian wildfires in 2023 contributed more emissions to the atmosphere than the humans in Canada did, for example. And that's like not necessarily a situation going forward, but it's an example of when the planet starts to contribute its own emissions. Yeah. And so here's a great graphic that shows how that budget can translate into a trajectory of emissions reduction. This also serves to show that, you know, this is in keeping with the way people are thinking about this problem. We know that this is what it looks like, that steep declines are required. Globally, we need to be at zero emissions before 2040 if we want to have a 1.5 degree warmer world. Yeah, so Canada's Paris target that we've declared we're committed to is to be at net zero by 2050, and BC's target is to be at 80% by 2050. And we don't have a net zero target at this time. So I'm starting to connect this for us with like, you know, what are our current plans and are they good enough? And assuming that Canada, as they say, are aiming for the levels of warming that we've committed to, it's not adding up. Carrie, did you have a thought? Okay. And so this is why you might see people talk about this as an emergency situation. like the time remaining within which we have to act is less than the time it takes to comfortably get these emissions down. We have to move faster than it's easy to do without sort of emergency level, faster than comfortable responses. Just another perspective from Professor Simon Donner in BC, showing basically the same thing, thinking about the problem in the same way. And now we get into fairness, so
Can you back up for a second?
I think so.
Oh. There's gotta be a button.
There is, I don't know the button.
So I just wanted to understand, so this is basically saying each one of these parties, this is the probability of reaching those targets. I'm not sure I understand this.
Sure, yeah, so what Simon Donner did was he took the policy promises from the last federal election.
Yeah,
And he plugged them into emissions reduction targets and then he compared them with the pathways that lead to different warming levels. So we saw on the previous slide how steep that trajectory to 1.5 is. And Simon Donner has that same steep trajectory of decreasing emissions. And then he just throws in addition onto this graph, where the policy promises of the parties would take us.
and why is the liberal one a band as opposed to a line?
I guess it's a range, you probably,
Because
so,
the policies might have plus or minus, okay.
yeah, exactly. Like, the carbon tax would be one that has, we're not sure exactly how it plays out, it's an influence on people's decisions, but it could result in a variety of reductions.
Okay, fair enough, thanks.
Yeah. And so now I want to talk about fairness. So we talked about that one way to think about this is we have a budget of pollution that can go into the atmosphere. And so the next question to decide how far and how fast is to determine how much of that pollution we can emit. And that can be talked about in terms of like fairness. What's our fair share of that budget? And this is a moral and a practical calculation because we might not be able to take more than our fair share. Taking more than our fair share might result in failure.
I'm struggling to read the graph. I guess there's something to think about. Can you just maybe point out what the words are in each of the lines?
Yeah, for sure. So this is our total emissions broken down into color bands of different sectors, starting with oil and gas in the production phase, transportation emissions, industry, buildings, electricity production, and other.
Thank you.
1990 till 2018, it looks like, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And so similar to the last couple of graphs, we have there's sort of like a couple of different trajectories that we can be on. And instead of trajectories being different warming levels, this is looking at a 1.5 target, because that's what we all said that we were gonna do at the national level. And it just shows a couple of different options. This is one person's calculation about our fair share. If we were to follow our fair share, this is how fast and steep. And we're gonna get a little bit more into this, but it's like negative 140% reduction by 2030 is one fair share target that we should have. And you can compare that, remembering that current BC target is 40% reduction by 2030. Hopefully they'll be reinforced a bit as we move to clearer graphics. Yeah, so that's just a quote from the Paris Agreement, which is that when we signed the Paris Agreement, we committed to limiting, sorry, it's behind, I'll fix that for the next round. When we signed on to the Paris Agreement, we committed to not just aiming for the warming levels, but also to do that with fairness in mind, knowing that some countries deserve and will increase their emissions to lift people out of poverty and get themselves to a basic standard of living. And that means that other countries with higher historical emissions and the greater capability, resource-wise and wealth-wise, to reduce emissions need to move faster. So that is already baked in. We already signed on to that agreement. This is a whole bunch of smart people's estimates of Canada's fair share of the remaining carbon budget. And you can see all the ones on this side of the graph. I'll use the mouse pointer for those online. All the ones on this side of the graph show a negative budget. So we've already spent our pollution space, our fair pollution space. And then there's a few on the other side of the line. These are unfair ways of sharing the budget. And so that's the only way that we have sort of like space in the budget is if we proceed with unfairness. And then just reiterating from the last slide that I'm blanking on CANRAC, that's Climate Action Network, national climate leading organization. They suggest a target of 140%, and for practical purposes, they say we should do that with 60% reductions by 2030 and 80% sort of offsets broad, so helping other people reduce. Because obviously it'd be hard to get to zero tomorrow. And then we might wonder the flip side of this equation, how much warming do we get if everybody takes more than their fair share? And there's a bunch of different ways to do that. And it could be as high as 4 degrees. But other people are reducing faster than we are. So thankfully, we already know that many countries are not taking our unfair approach. So yeah, we can restore fairness by moving really fast and by making big contributions in other parts of the world. And there's a really super cool tool called the Climate Equity Reference Calculator, which well, I won't go into that, but if you want to get into it, you could play around with it. It's a whole thing, and it lets you tweak the dial on fairness to see what kind of trajectory we could be on. And it helps think through what kinds of fairness aspects there are, because there's historical emissions, and do you want to start that when we knew for sure about climate change, which some people peg at 1988, some people put at 1990. Do you want to do it based on wealth? Anyways, one more opinion. Here's some pretty authoritative resource saying that, yeah, Canada's action and policies get us right to the edge of, right to the edge of a 3-degree world. And, here's how far we are this distance from a sort of 2-degree world. And then down here is where we would need to head for a 1.5-degree world. And when I have asked the BC government to explain how their current targets are Paris compliant, and they do acknowledge that they look to the Paris Agreement for fairness, they say that they lean on the government of Canada to give them to lead the way on how to interpret fairness. And they say, we seek to ensure internal regional fairness in addition to other dimensions of fairness. So that's like we don't want to move faster than Manitoba or Alberta necessarily, because that would put us at an economic disadvantage. It's a bit unsettling to hear them make those statements. And they say we aim to avoid negative outcomes for values such as affordability, economic growth, equity, and competitiveness. So, yeah, it's true. At this late stage, 30 years of relative inaction, it's gonna hurt to move fast enough. And so they do acknowledge that that's something that they're balancing. But they don't, I think, disagree with the rest of this logic. And I think it's beyond dangerous and unacceptable.
That's what they are saying.
Those are my words, that's my response to their logic. And, I think this is worth noting, another slide from our own local climate analyst, Barry Saxifrage. It's just worth noting that Canada actually leads the pack on, per capita responsibility. And that's considering historical emissions.
So how does that square with the fairness index that we saw earlier? 'Cause it seemed like we'd already blown past our fairness budget.
Yeah, so this is one aspect of the fairness calculation, is how much have you emitted in the past, right? How much of the budget have you used already in the last 150 years? Or sometimes people take the last 30 years.
And this is saying on a per capita basis, how much governments are taking the lead on trying to address it.
So this is how much responsibility historical emission, based on historical emissions we have. So this is not a good thing to be leading. Yeah, sorry, that's not totally clear. We are more responsible on a per capita basis owing to past emissions.
Oh, leads the pack
In culpability, you might say.
Yeah.
Responsibility in terms of culpability. Yeah,
Makes sense.
I'll refine that slide next time.
Yes.
I was going, oh, well, we're doing well.
And then we also have a problem related to all of this is, whether or not we meet our targets, which is the next big area of concern. So we have a lot of heavy lifting to do. How much warming will we get if we extrapolated our current levels of effort? Bunch of math, some of it arguable and debatable. People arrive at different answers. I won't take up too much time, but it's between, certainly between 2 and 3 degrees, maybe as high as 4 degrees, which is really bad. And if we proceed with unfairness, what does it mean? What does it mean to try to achieve 1.5 with unfairness? Well, you'd have to stop other countries from burning fossil fuels, which is probably not possible and pretty wrong thing to do. Or it could mean that we have to transfer a whole bunch of wealth and resources and expertise so that we can lift people up out of poverty in a clean way. And maybe we need to do everything, reduce our emissions and help those other folks. That's the end of my chunk.
Would you like to go down?
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Max. And should we have a little break now? Could people use a 5-minute break before we get into the next segment?
For anyone who came in real life, I brought hazelnuts and bubbly drinks. Please help yourself. Bathroom break. Thank you.
Okay, see you in about 5 minutes.
If anybody from the online world wants to check in and have a casual chat, let me know. I'm open to feedback about all of that. And I can check the chat here. Yeah, Jeanette's talking about a bathtub analogy.
That's, well, that's.
Yeah, tell
what
us about it.
Comes up in Climate Interactive. I was just thinking that some of what you've presented integrates really well with what comes out of Climate Interactive, but it's a bit overwhelming in trying to follow all your graphs up front, and that's because it's great, it's great stuff, but it's like one of Climate Interactive's things is get the engagement first, and then you'll ask the questions. I mean, certainly, I'm glad you said you're going to send out the slides.
Happy to, yeah.
Yeah, because there's a lot of really good information, but they are a lot to take in. But I am amazed at what you've done in pulling that together. Thank you. We'll talk more later.
Cool, yeah, that sounds good. That's a really good point. Get people playing with it, and then, cause yeah, like this, part of my process was probably like starting to ponder these things in different ways, and before I arrived at like, oh, this is actually the things that I need to figure out is like, how do we just decide how much is enough, sort of thing. So I totally hear what you're saying.
The En-ROADS thing, is that something we can interact with? You said it is interactive, the MIT thing. Can we go online and interact with that?
Totally, yeah,
It's for the public, it's like a cool.
yeah, the tool that we're gonna play with it together. That's our next chunk. It's gonna get less presenty and more
Yeah.
interactive. And then if you wanna play with it on your own at home,
We still could, or show it to someone.
or at a dinner party
Yeah.
on your own, or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've played with it a bit myself. It feels good to at least pretend like you have your hand on a lever
I've played
and
with
just
it
dial it
before.
over.
There's like the ecological footprint one, but it's too general. Well,
Uh-huh.
it's way too general. It's like doesn't really, it's.
Right, and usually those have like a survey process, and it's not till you
Yeah.
get to the
It
end.
doesn't.
It would be interesting to have like
And
a
it doesn't
personal
tell you really
footprint.
why, and you can't say, okay, if you eat, if you get your own needs, then where,
Right.
how did it, like, it's not, it doesn't break it down into,
Mhm. Yeah,
it's very general. I feel like if you live in the middle of the city, you probably could just sort of.
right. Yeah, and I think this level that En-ROADS model works at is also at the global level, so it
Yeah.
maybe won't touch so much on how much meat each of us eats, but we'll see. I'm new to it too, and well, I feel better getting that off my chest.
It's really good.
Yeah, so. Thank you. I'm sorry, to leave minutes from all of it.
Maybe it's for the best. Probably know all that.
I'd sleep better.
I'm always impressed with PowerPoint.
Oh, yeah. It's a good way to bedazzle people. Not too alien.
Still behind trying to present that.
Well, it makes it easier to present. That's the secret, I think. I've only done it twice, if anything, but it's like, it's like helps you remember what you're talking about, in theory.
I have a hazelnut question before I break.
Hazelnut question.
How do you cure your hazelnuts? Do you do anything like other than just air dry at home?
These ones in particular came out of the bulk bin at the co-op.
Oh, okay. I was assuming they were yours.
But I did get to pick some hazelnuts this year, and yeah, just hang them in some mesh bags in the house for a little while. No.
Put them in your dehydrator.
No, never done that. Warm part of the house,
Yeah.
at first, until they feel like, for like a month,
Okay.
yeah.
We
Which
got
is,
some away from the squirrels this year. What's that?
No, it's weird, the schools didn't get first, I was like, these.
Well, our schools are pretty busy. I had to, I picked the ones I got. They got everything off the ground up. They're fast.
Yeah, no, but.
Mary, do you still have, chestnut babies? Well, I'm totally ready for them now.
Are you?
Yeah,
Good.
yeah. What do you need, plain?
I think we've got everybody back in our room. Christine, if you wanna
Like, is now a good time?
take us away.
Sure. Let's share
Good,
my
it's called
screen
Chestnut
again.
Path.
Goes up request, Christine, increase her volume.
I can increase Christine's volume.
Thank you.
Great, great, I'll pick you up, I would love that. Yay.
Okay, we're gonna do the next stage.
Okay, can you folks see the screen I'm sharing?
Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, it's pretty small.
Is it pretty small? Okay, let me try to make that bigger. Hmm.
Can you close the chat? That'll help.
Is that a little better?
It's better.
It's full size.
It's full size
when I'm
on your
looking at
screen?
it.
Okay. For the folks who are attending in person, is it a little better now that the chat window is closed?
I really like Sloan. Happy birthday to you. Yeah. Go read that.
How you focus on.
We'll read that tonight at bedtime.
Max, can you
That might
focus?
be as good as it gets.
Pardon me, Max,
Yeah.
can you see this? Is the screen displaying okay? The share screen, is it okay on your end?
Yes, we were
Okay.
making some adjustments, but I think we've made them.
Okay. Perfect. Well, here we are back to the En-ROADS simulator. And I'll just give you a little bit of background before we dive in. It is an integrated assessment model. And so what that means is that it pulls together data from Earth system models, which simulate in pretty high resolution what could play out over from decades to centuries to millennia in the climate, and as well as economic information and energy system information from top sources. And one of the cool things about En-ROADS is that anyone can access it. You can go to the Climate Interactive website and just click on to launch the En-ROADS simulator. And it's pretty quick. So unlike a lot of models, which you might have to run for perhaps even months, if you set up an experiment to run a single, to set up an experiment to answer a single question, this model is actually set up to allow us to play with those styles and get results pretty quickly, more or less immediately, to certain types of questions. And so just lead us back to that simulator in a moment, but the way this was developed was kind of inspired by Buckminster Fuller, and it's based on the philosophy that if you let people play with something, play with a tool, then they might be more likely to be able to invite new ideas or think of things differently than if you just tell them a lot of information. So a little bit of background, though, just not to continue to load you with more slides, but just it could be good to bear in mind in terms of what we're looking at when we look at the simulator. So in this simulation, you'll see a black line in one of the main graphs, and that will represent kind of if we do nothing, a business as usual type of scenario. And it's based on current policy. And I can say that since I started using this simulator to do workshops, initially, the baseline scenario showed an increased temperature increase of 3.6 degrees Celsius by 2100. The more recent updated version of the model shows a temperature increase of 3.3 degrees Celsius. And so what they do for their baseline is they look at all the policies that have been implemented. They don't use what people or what countries or regions plan to do in the future. They put what people have actually implemented, and they use that as their baseline. And then the blue line is what will change based on which policies we decide to implement as a group. And a couple of things that, or one thing that I also mentioned earlier in the workshop, this concept of SSPs, the shared socioeconomic pathways. Just wanted to do a reminder of what that was and go into slight more detail about what these numbers after SSP mean. Because we'll be revisiting this a little bit later when we look at some maps of how drought might increase depending on which scenario we find ourselves in the future in BC. So they are these kind of overarching narratives, SSP1 being the most sustainable type of scenario, SSP2 being where there is a fair amount of cooperation, but it's just, we don't really get to where we get with SSP1. And then, you go all the way to SSP5, which has very high greenhouse gas emissions. And the ones that we'll be focusing on primarily, and in part because these are the scenarios that were modeled by a BC Climate Institute for drought. So it's a little bit of a matter of convenience, but I just wanted to show that SSP 126 is generally considered to be one of the more sustainable scenarios that you might hear about. And it's expected to have, this range of temperatures towards the end of the century for anywhere from 1.3 to 2.4. So we're often talking in probabilities. Here, the estimated warming for that is 1.8, so it's still above 1.5. 1.9 that you see at the top of this table it was specifically modeled because people wanted to see what it would take to get to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, to have a pretty good chance of that.
Christine,
Yeah.
somebody else needs to be muted here.
You know what? It's possible that my child is playing in the background. Do you hear someone saying goal over and over? Yeah, that's
No, it's an adult voice.
Oh, it's possible that it's my spouse. Maybe if it's one of those two, I can try to ask the grown-up to not make as much noise. I apologize for this. If someone else is unmuted, I welcome you to mute yourself.
I did check that, and I think if it's your family life, then it's something we will live with.
Okay, sorry about that.
If there was another participant, then I would turn them off. So we'll live with it.
All right. Thank you, though. And yeah, and so that less sustainable pathway SSP 2.45 or 4.5 is estimated to have significantly over 2 degrees warming by the end of the century, and the range here given is, 2.1 to 3.5 degrees Celsius. So just to have that awareness in the background as we're going through this. And here's that drought slide to keep in mind for as we talk about this as well. So on the left, you can see this SSP 2.2, and there's dashes, there's dots. People often just say 245. I'll just say it that way. It's a little easier. And then on the right, there's SSP 126. What is being shown on these maps is something called the Standardized Precipitation and Evapotranspiration Index, which is one of the ways that drought is forecast. And if you look at the vertical bar that's showing the increase, or like the legend basically of increase or decrease in, SPEI, the middle of the bar is kind of this bluey beige, right near the word September. And everything going towards the dark blue is an increase to 3 or beyond. And everything going to the dark brown is going to a decrease to 3 or beyond. And the decrease side of the scale is what relates to moisture deficit. And so that the darker brown it is showing the more tendency for there to be drought in a particular area, in a particular scenario. So in terms of coastal BC, well, the data doesn't map onto the coast very well, but we can kind of look at this spot on the island for just a little bit of a sense of what this could be like in your location. And you can see that I think the main takeaway here is that in SSP 245, so that like less successful but somewhat sustainable pathway, you have some greater tendency towards drought, you know, in this coastal area. Whereas in the SSP 126, you have, it's like that bluey beige. So that's kind of like, it's not really a change. So it would be a similar conditions for things like agriculture or related to potential like for wildfire ignition. And now just to also take this in a local context, this is a graph from the Clean BC plan published in 2018, and it shows a breakdown of the emissions reductions that would be undertaken to achieve the 2030 target of, I believe it is 50% below 2007 emissions. And here it's noted in megatons. When we start talking about the global scale, we're going to talk about gigatons again, but obviously in the province, we thankfully don't have that large an amount of reductions to make. But here, you know, you can see that industry is the sector where the greatest amount of reductions would be planned to be made. Second biggest areas would be from transportation, and then future reductions. So that's kind of like at the time to be identified areas for reductions, 24%. And then carbon pricing was expected or is expected to contribute just over 7% of the reduction. Buildings and communities would be about 8% of the reduction. And then waste, that could be things like capture of greenhouse gases or flaring of greenhouse gases from landfills, but also potentially related to agriculture. So that does provide a reduction as well. And so what I did is I looked at all these different policy areas and I tried to map them onto the policy areas that are represented in En-ROADS. So the next slide, you'll see here in Clean BC, the transportation reductions are related to more zero emission vehicles. Less so, and there's also some practices, not just like changing in consumer choice, but like less driving or cleaner fuel for cars, which we already, I think, are starting to implement. The buildings and communities category had things like policies like energy efficiency, better buildings, and help for the community to achieve less emissions from their buildings. You know, and then the list goes on. Industry would be through cleaner transportation, electrification, etc. Now, some of these categories that the Clean BC policy categories map to in En-ROADS would be under transportation. Here we have a policy for electrification. Under buildings and industry and En-ROADS, the En-ROADS model, we have efficiency and electrification. For carbon dioxide removal, that's something that comes into play potentially in industry. Here, the CCS, carbon capture and storage, in En-ROADS would be kind of in their technological category. And then other sources of greenhouse gases could be represented. And I tried to color code these so you could kind of see a little bit at a glance how they're, which ones are similar to each other. Agricultural emissions would be similar to what in Clean BC is called organic waste reduction or conversion to fuel. And then carbon pricing is kind of the same in both. So, and I did a little calculation of how, and so the Clean BC goal target is to reduce emissions by 80% below 2007 emissions by 2050. And so when I took that amount of emissions and I translated it to the global scale, so I took the global emissions in 2007, something like 47 point something gigatons. And then I said, okay, what would 20% of that be? So there would be 20% of those emissions remaining by 2050. And then so that's where you see this blue line kind of dip and then kind of taper a little bit to 2100. You get a temperature if these policies, the way I interpreted it, which you can see with all these the blue highlights on the dials, or the sliders rather, that was my interpretation of how Clean BC could look if applied globally. It would result in a temperature increase by the end of the century of 1.9 degrees. So over the 1.5 target that the world has committed to, but still slightly below the 2 degree. And Max may chime in a little bit later because it's possible to get different numbers with these things. And I'd be curious if we have time about which number he might have gotten thinking through these things. But now it's to turn it over to you folks and talk about, as a group, what type of reduction might we like to aim for, and then we'll play with the simulator and see what it would take to get there. So, does anyone have any strong views on what emissions reduction target we might like to aim for?
I do.
What would that be?
Well, the Paris Agreement says we gotta aim for 1.5. We already agreed.
Okay.
Everybody said it out loud and signed it. We're aiming for 1.5. And well below 2 degrees. Which I think people usually think of as like, 1.6, 1.7. That's our backstop, but we're aiming for 1.5.
So would folks like to go for that? Should we use a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature change by the end of the century as our goal, working through a simulation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we can backtrack. We can do the math to see, okay, what percentage of emissions reductions was that actually to get us there? So that would be a good exercise. Okay, so can everyone see the simulator now?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so this is actually one that was done with Jeanette from a workshop that she participated in recently. So I just wanted to show a quick example of what that could look like. And we got it down to 1.9 in that workshop. So let's see. I will click us to a fresh one here. And here we go. So this is just using a web browser. I don't have anything special installed on my computer. Where should we start? There's these different categories. There's energy supply, transportation, buildings and energy, growth, carbon dioxide removal, and then other sources of greenhouse gases. And folks can kind of discuss, if we are kind of going into one, we can talk about what it means if people have questions. And then one of the cool things about this model, which we might not get to a lot today, but is you can actually click and go into more detail to customize how the policy is working. And you can also look at equity considerations and different dynamics that could come into play with different policies. So it's kind of a cool tool if you want to dig into things. So where should we start?
I would like to start with the current very contentious one, which is carbon price.
Okay, all right. Well, Jeanette, what degree, so right now it's at status quo, what amount of carbon price would you like to try first?
I would like to go for the maximum.
The maximum, okay. All right, let's see. So we're driving it up here. We're going from low to high to very high. Okay, and what did we see here? I just want to kind of like retrace our steps. So we saw coal get squeezed out quite a bit, and we saw gas get squeezed out quite a bit, oil as well. Yeah, that's the main things that did. It didn't necessarily increase renewables, but it did reduce the fossil fuels usage a lot. Probably because when fossil fuels get more expensive to use, people will moderate their consumption. And that got us down to 2.4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So that was over a degree of decrease. So that was like pretty powerful. But then, you know, you kind of look at that's $250 a ton. So
Oh my God.
what's that?
That's a big number.
That's a gas.
It's a
in the
big-
room.
But it's
Yeah.
also close to the social cost of carbon. It's also close to what governments are saying that each ton of carbon dioxide costs society at large.
Right.
It's just not subsidizing the fossil fuel industry by letting them externalize their social costs.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, so it's obviously a very powerful policy. But then it can, what could we say? There could be some challenges to implementing it to like very strongly, as we're seeing in our own milieu, and it could be potentially complemented by other policies that alleviate like some affordability issues that some people might encounter and might cause some opposition. But what other policies could we apply since we haven't gotten down to our 1.5 degrees yet?
Let's go high on renewables.
High on renewables, okay. All right, so we're increasing renewables, and here, okay, I just want to watch what's happening with the graph. So the green section is growing. It did grow. It you know, it's interesting because it didn't actually make enough of a bump to get to a lower temperature, and also it didn't actually shrink the remaining use of fossil fuels. Probably because it could need another policy to pair with, or some other policies to pair with, to ensure that this remaining fossil fuel use gets squeezed out more.
I'd like to see deforestation go all the way down.
Okay,
Can I just see what that looks like?
yeah, sure thing. Pardon this unhappy child. Let's see.
Cool,
Okay.
and then what about population? Can we change that down a
Yeah.
bit?
You want it to go down a bit? Okay.
Yeah. Oh, wow, that doesn't really, oh,
Okay, so there's low population growth, and that did make a bump to lower temperature.
How about electrification of buildings?
Electrification of buildings. Okay, let's go to buildings and electrification. Okay, so if we do like say medium amount, not seeing a bump yet. Let's see if we go all the way to the end. Still no bump.
That's probably because this model is predicated on a lot of that electricity being supplied by
yeah.
gas and coal and oil and.
Let's drop coal down. Oh, there's it's not even that much coal there. in the first place.
Well, let's see if we drop coal down. So now it's getting more highly taxed. It is squeezing it out a little bit in the graph, but if we go all the way, it only squeezes so much though, and it didn't really give us a bump.
So what is the thing, because you've used this, like, what is the secret? What is the thing that actually gets it down there?
Give us the answer.
Well, there's not one single answer. So that's what the kind of interesting thing is that you could have a bunch of different combinations of policies in varying degrees that combine to get a certain result. So if we get to 1.5, it probably isn't the only way that you could get to 1.5. But another clue that I could give, or another tip, is that if we were to also electrify transportation, we'll probably see gas and oil go down, I think. So if we could try that, okay. Okay, that actually didn't make a bump. So let's look at this. Let's think about this. Okay, so we have high renewables. We have very highly taxed coal, so it's really discouraging coal use. We have a high carbon price. Well, you know what? High carbon price could already be discouraging so much of the use of fossil fuels that you don't get as big of a bump by electrifying transportation, because maybe people are limiting their transportation significantly already. So like if we hadn't had a high carbon price, and we did some of these sliders and the measure we have done them, like especially the electrification, we might see more of an impact from those policies.
What
So
about pushing energy efficiency for buildings?
efficiency for buildings, okay, and then I see Jessica's hand up too. Okay, so we'll do increase energy efficiency for buildings. Okay, yeah, that's getting us a decrease, and you can see that it's decreasing the use of fossil fuels, so it's also decreasing the use of renewable energy. And then Jessica, did you have one that you'd like to see us try?
Could we try increasing the nature-based carbon dioxide removal?
Yeah, sure thing. Okay, so we'll increase this. So here I just did to medium, and that gave a bump of a decrease of 0.1 degrees Celsius. Would you like me to try it more?
Yeah, let's see what happens.
Okay.
Okay,
so yeah, so it looks like we're able to get a decrease of 0.2 degrees Celsius from that would mostly be adding lots of trees, including in places where they maybe haven't grown like in the past 50 years, or maybe even over longer time periods. Yeah.
About waste and leakage, greenhouse gases.
Waste and leakage. Okay, yeah, let's go for that. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, so we're getting below 2 degrees, so that's quite good. And then, oh yeah, that's making quite a difference, isn't it, already? Let's see. So we're already down 0.2. And that, I'm just trying to see in the energy, the global sources of energy. I guess that's not gonna affect the energy sources as much, but it still does reduce emissions. So that's, and then therefore reduce temperature.
It's the methane that we're reducing, and it's much more powerful.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So if we go even more, we don't continue to get as much of a bump, but even to kind of like a halfway measure, it still did that 0.2 degree decrease.
So what happens if we do all this and then we put the carbon price back down?
Let's see. So if you put a medium carbon price with all these other measures, then it gets, you see, 0.1%, or not 0.1 degrees higher.
So bring oil down a tiny bit, just to see.
Okay. Yeah, even doing it a lot, I guess there's certain uses of oil that people are willing to still pay for. I mean, it's not a lot of as much oil use, but trying to think what it could be. I mean, we could try so there's several that we haven't tried.
How about everybody stops eating beef? So
Okay. Okay, yeah, agricultural emissions, yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, yeah, so if like diet changes, like let's say kind of more than a bit, but about a quarter measure, then we got a decrease of 0.1 degrees Celsius. And then if we keep going, we do get another bump. So we're already down to 1.6 degrees Celsius.
So what would that be like? No meat at all?
Yeah, this like is probably a combination of what people's diets are. And actually here are some graphs that we can look at quickly right now. Here, impacts related to, I don't know, land, forestry, and food. And then I think there's one for meat consumption.
You said you do food from animals?
Food from animals, thank you.
Should be a reduction
Where-
in nitrogen.
why, oh, here we go. So, okay, so, percent food from animals, okay, interestingly, that is not a very big difference in the, percent food from animals. So let's look, because let's see, agricultural emissions would be from,
Yeah.
From agriculture.
so maybe we would have to increase, like, or like we'd have to kind of put that. Oh wait, that's increasing the food from animals. You'd also decrease the food from, okay, so we'd have to customize that even more to say much less food from animals. But here in the model, sometimes it puts caps on things because it says, you know what, it's probably not realistic for people to eat 0% animals as like a global diet. So they kind of limit it. The lowest we can put it here is 10%.
That's, yeah. Where would mining fit into any of this?
I think in industry, and well, there could be some emissions from transportation related to mining. But I would say it's probably in this model mostly in industry.
How do you break down industry? Deeper into the.
Most industry uses oil or diesel, so it's probably built into the farm. Oil.
Oh, yes, but energy efficiency of new buildings.
Here they have energy efficient practices. Okay, here they're talking primarily about buildings. Let's see about electrification here. Increase in electricity instead of fossil fuels and buildings, appliances, heating systems, other machines. Okay, so I guess it could be machines used in industry.
Probably
Yeah.
oil and natural gas. Energy supply.
What if we just got rid of all fossil fuels?
Get rid of all fossil. Yeah, we could do that. Here, get rid of oil completely. Okay, and I'll go back to the regular the default graph. Okay, so get rid of oil, get rid of natural gas, or highly tax it, I guess is how it is in this model. We could remove bioenergy, which I know is a fossil fuel. Like, I mean, it still emits carbon dioxide, but it is kind of cycling from. It's not taking. Maybe I can put bioenergy back because it's not taking the energy out of or it's not taking the carbon out of an underground reserve, so it doesn't quite behave as the same as.
1.5, we've just gotten rid of fossil fuels.
Good point, Carrie. So that 1.5 just shut down the entire global economy.
Right.
Okay, but this is, yeah, so this is like what we
Well,
do though.
We are at 1.5 though, actually. I should have flagged that. So we did succeed in getting to 1.5, and this was without decreasing economic growth. So I mean, you could potentially put a little bit of, decrease. Let's see if it actually. Okay, so decreasing economic growth did not give us a real bump. It gave us a 0.1 degrees Celsius bump. So I've seen that in a few simulations, is that sometimes we expect economic growth, like putting it way low, will make a very dramatic difference. But in part because the population is still growing to the end of the century, it can only do so much because of kind of development to, as Max was talking about, help people emerge from poverty. It kind of only does so much. Yeah, I see a hand up.
Yeah, hi folks, Cease Robinson here. I was just curious if there's a way in this model to alter the baseline to reflect the fact that Canada doesn't count emissions from what we sell. the fossil fuels that we export to the rest of the world and get burnt elsewhere, we feel is somebody else's responsibility. And it's a little bit like a cigarette company saying that we make cigarettes in the cleanest way that the world has ever seen, and our employees are all on the greatest health plan and everything is sweet and cool. That's what Canada is doing. And Canada does not count those emissions.
Right.
Is there a way to include that reality? Because it changes everything.
Right. Well, a couple of things. So, I mean, in this model, because we are looking at the global situation, even though, you know, Canada has a certain amount of emissions domestically, it still would count the emissions that are happening elsewhere from, you know, fossil fuels exported from Canada. But there is another model that this organization has developed called C-ROADS. And it actually breaks down emissions more by region. So you could have North America, you know, South America, Eurasia. I haven't used it as much, but it does break things down by region, and it might not capture exactly what you're talking about, but it could give a little bit more of a regional perspective. So those are my attempts to say that you can kind of maybe see a little bit of what you're talking about, but not a real good direct analysis. No.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I have one quick question. I'm just wondering about natural based emission sources like permafrost melt, with the amount of methane coming from permafrost being such a sizable, scalable amount, even compared to human caused methane emissions. Is that factored in?
I would say, I see Jeanette nodding. Do you want to speak to that?
It's well, because it's there as one of the feedback.
Okay, so
so yes, the feedbacks are taken into account, and that's one of the things, yes, that increases as the temperature goes up. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and I think like one of the things too is that so these Earth system models that feed into part of this model, so, like they can take different approaches to modeling certain feedbacks, like what Jeanette's talking about, and what we have in this model is kind of the average of how they all do together. So that's usually considered the best estimate. But you know, I think like with the models, that's what it is. It's a kind of a best estimate. So I tend to think that like we ought to be like more lean on the more conservative side, like assume things might be slightly worse than what the models sometimes tell us, because sometimes what people are finding is that you know, how things are playing out in reality is like a little bit worse than some of the models anticipate. So but that's just me. I'm more risk averse. Some people are less risk averse. So, you know, there's all different dispositions in these things. But yeah.
So you're saying that the feedback loops are kind of built into the model, and different models use different assumptions, but the higher the temperature goes, like it gets hot faster in this model due to the feedback loops. That's one question.
Yeah,
like permafrost and the
yeah, like because how this model works is like it takes the data that comes out of all these Earth system models, which some of them, like one person that is in our lab, she's a postdoc, but she used a Canadian Earth system model to run an experiment, and it's been taking several months for the model to run because it's just so high resolution and it has so many processes like this feature with the permafrost and like so many other processes.
Speak up, Christine.
Okay, yeah, I was just saying that, you know, as an example, you know, someone I know is running a model that is like quite high resolution, has like a lot of processes represented in it, and it is taking several months to to render. But this one that we're using here online right now, it's instantaneous because it takes the data already that came from these models that take a long time to run, and it integrates it into the results we're seeing. So it can do it a lot faster. But yeah, like different models will have like a little bit of a different take on how to represent certain things that are happening in their system. And what is used in this is kind of the average of many models, which is considered kind of the best estimate for how things could unfold in the future.
So my other question is, I'm kind of proud that we didn't choose the technological carbon dioxide removal, because my understanding is that that's a real red herring. But now I'm curious about how your model treats it.
Okay, sure. Well, let's look at this here. So here they characterize it as direct air capture and enhanced mineralization. One is I mean, what I've heard of for direct air capture is like a chemical based process where, you know, you suck air in, it goes through a chemical process that captures the carbon dioxide and then, you know, releases the remaining gas. And then enhanced mineralization, some folks might be familiar with that too, is actually something that, you know, like in mining, they talk about this, taking the, you know, rock, you know, that they don't use in whatever process they're undertaking, and you'd crush the rock, and then the rock oxidizes, so it like, or it captures the carbon dioxide when fresh rock face is exposed, and that's referred to as enhanced mineralization, and sometimes people talk about it doing it with certain minerals on beaches. But then there are some considerations with each of these, like direct air capture can be pretty expensive to do. It's like way better to not emit the greenhouse gases in the first place.
Well, exactly, which is why I'm curious about if we choose technological carbon removal, how much it can actually toggle down the final temperature.
Okay, let's try it here. So there's just a little bit of it. It's not bumping it too much here. There we got a bit of a bump with medium application to 1.4 degrees Celsius. So, but even if you do it in an extreme measure, it doesn't, with this combination, doesn't get us that much more than medium.
What is interesting in that one to note is that it actually takes the net emissions to below zero, the net emissions, and is the zero emission mark around 2670 or whatever. I have found that their bathtub image, in terms of looking at why net zero still has a temperature rise, is a really useful model. I don't know if you've got the
Let's see if I can pull that up.
Oh, it's not that.
There we go. Yeah. Do you want to talk about this, Jeanette? Or?
Well, I just think that the idea, because the greenhouse gases stay, like what's in the atmosphere, they have an effect. Now, normally, before we started doing all this, the emissions, because obviously there are natural emissions into the atmosphere, were always balanced by the sinks, like the sources and the sinks equaled. So that meant that the bathtub never filled up. You turned the tap on with the CO2 emissions, and the drain, it all drained out. And so there was none left to create a greenhouse gas effect. But once you've gone through a time when emissions are greater than removals, then you start raising the level in the bathtub. So when we say net zero emissions, what we're actually meaning is that the inflow and the outflow balance. But then that just means that the bathtub stays at the same level. So that's why if we want to, if we want to actually reverse or go in the other way, we have to lower the level in the bathtub. And that's when we're talking about having, rather than net zero, going down to negative. And that's also when Max was talking about the fairness thing, because there was at one point where he was saying, like in Canada, that's because we are responsible for such a high level of emissions per capita, that's one of the things that we actually need to look at. So if we look at our BC, what we've contributed already to fill the bathtub, we need to be making sure that what we're removing exceeds what we're putting in, because we have a bigger share of the water that's already in the bathtub. Now, I don't know whether that helps anyone else or not.
Yeah.
That's kind of why I found this particular model or image that they use very, very helpful.
Well, thank you for that. Thanks for flagging that. And yeah, and it is pretty interesting that we got to a place with negative emissions here, and that you could see that even without exhausting every single option, it is possible to get to below 1.5 degrees Celsius increase by the end of the century. So that's also pretty cool. Now, I know we just have about 6 minutes left in our scheduled time, so I will return to the slides here. And I will just mention some options that you might want to explore on your own. So we did look at some graphs in the models, looking at the change in percent of food from animal sources was one example. There are quite a few graphs that you could choose from, some that could show how some of these policies might impact agriculture are under land, forestry, and food. The one we looked at, the percent of food from animals, but also farmland area and land for farming with CO2 removal. So that would be one nature-based carbon dioxide removal method, in addition to probably planting lots of trees. And then in terms of wildfire, you might want to look at the under impacts temperature change and also frequency of extreme heat. I did want to flag, one common Earth system model limitation is that that often wildfires are not modeled in these models, even though they do put a lot of processes in, and more of them are starting to incorporate wildfire modeling, but that is a big source of emissions that is sometimes not captured in some of these model outputs that are used to like anticipate what could happen in the future. So that's something to bear in mind. And I did want to go through a little bit of a brainstorm with you folks, but I'm also aware that we're getting short on time. So Max, can I look to you for some feedback on this final stage of the workshop?
Yeah, like whether to stick with our 7 o'clock timeline or go through what you have.
Yeah, and it may be in like a slightly shorter version than I originally planned, or I can wind things down and hand it back over to you.
I don't know. How are people feeling?
I'm ready to start. I need to get fit home. Yeah, keep going.
I think I saw mostly thumbs up, and maybe a couple people will trickle out. So if you're happy to keep going, I'm happy to keep going.
Okay, sure thing.
And folks can leave if they need to leave.
All right. Yeah. So we've talked about some potential climate change impacts. We looked at that map of potential increased risk of drought. We looked at how there may be more hotter days and also less precipitation. So I wanted to check with the group on ideas for oh, and here, sorry, I mislabeled my slide here for mitigation. Max had kind of flagged that this information about sources of emissions on Cortes, and so I wanted to look to you folks for ideas for areas where you could see some mitigation happening. Now, we did hear off the top of some initiatives that are being undertaken related to organic waste, transportation, and the chipping service to that would be more of an adaptation, I guess, in terms of making things more safe or resilient to wildfire.
Is this our most current?
Goes to
2010.
It's 2010, it is the most current that we have, yeah. We don't know how much this has changed, it's probably changed in some ways, but also maybe hasn't changed that much.
Okay, I feel like it's very much changed since even I've been on the island.
Okay.
So, yeah,
Who puts this out and how do we get it updated?
yeah.
This was a group of volunteers stepping up in 2010, and
Finally was welcome. This,
Mark Lombard worked on it,
Yeah.
and Bill Andrews.
yeah,
I think that they leaned heavily on Salt Spring Island, who did a lot of this homework. And so we could find other communities as a shortcut that are similar to ours. So theirs. But what ways do you think this has changed? What's already been dealt with from this? There are some things. That same group, reduced Manson's Hall's oil heater load. We have heat pumps in most of the community buildings. Maybe that's halved fuel bill.
Yeah.
Cut that in half.
Yeah.
or if we were to say theoretically ask how many people on the island kind of drop over the fuel oil in replacement for heat pumps potentially too. Yeah, people are updating their buildings, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, firewood might have been going down, buildings firewood.
Yeah.
Airline travel, that's like us going off Cortes and flying somewhere.
Yeah,
We've also added some buildings.
Yeah.
So maybe we've converted some from firewood to heat pumps, but maybe we've also built some more housing.
I feel like imported construction materials would have probably gone up
yeah.
quite a bit.
Yeah. I was gonna say, when we were in the simulator, I was like, where's the billionaire slide?
Yeah.
That would be good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Definitely in the budget.
Yeah.
Factor of 10.
Land transportation.
It's a huge.
Huge.
Yeah.
Where's our bus?
How much has population changed?
Since
In the last
2010.
14
Very little.
years?
Very little.
Okay.
Really?
But what about static population like around?
But how, like, even like, when I first got here, it was like 800 year round,
According to the census, it's very low.
but then now it's like more, like almost 1,000.
Last census was like, we were just at 1,100.
Okay, so that's a big change for percentage, that's like almost 20%, isn't it?
Well, not according to the census.
Oh,
Yeah, I don't know where you got the 800.
like it was like 856 on the internet.
On the internet.
Yeah,
The internet.
yeah, yeah, so
I don't know.
it's been
I
close to
understand
11.
the population.
Flat. Yeah, about 1,035 is the last time I looked at stats count.
Year rounders.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so some questions around whether that's changed. We don't need to figure that out here.
Sure, no.
But that would assuming no change in behavior, then land transportation would be
Still
a
be.
function of population.
Yeah, we get this very electric. And the next.
That would be a big thing. That's a good target, electric ferry. One thing I've heard smart people say about this is like land transportation is a big chunk and we do need to tackle that, but it's also one of the harder chunks to tackle. And that some of the other chunks are like this is something we don't have to mess with people's personal choices around, right?
Right. And I guess encouraging more local food production.
I still wanna encourage all the people who are importing construction materials to not waste them. That's, you know, like the only thing I can see myself doing.
Yeah.
These are good ideas. Sorry, it took me a moment to unmute myself. I'm writing these things down so I can send them to Max as well, just to have a capture of the discussion here.
And then what's your, you said this too, like local aviation, is that like float planes and all of that? And then so airline travel is just our population traveling on airlines? Okay. Okay.
Okay.
I'd be interested how you what you measured or how you got the information to do this, because I would love to see if there's anyone willing to try and do something like that for Main Island. So
I can see you the full report that this is from.
that would be good to see, Matt. Thank you.
I better run and put it. Thank you, John, very. But, good to see you, Marta.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, buddy.
You won't want anything out tonight.
Okay. It occurs to me in terms of mitigation to, yeah, they're growing more local food. Sounded like that had some support, and I don't know how much land on Cortes is dedicated to agriculture, but sometimes agricultural land can be a good area for carbon sequestration, depending on what practices people are able to use.
Yeah, one thing I remember chatting with a researcher from Salt Spring, and they did their community's emissions, mapping like that. And one thing that they found was that I think it was 11 hectares of logging was equal to their land transportation emissions. So when they were going through this process, they were like, do we want to drive our cars around, or do we want to have this amount of logging? And so that was an interesting revelation they came to. I mean, we need to do both, but in which order maybe? Because you want to see how things. I don't even remember if we had forestry on ours, but we haven't had much forestry. Yes, in 2010 there was almost nothing happening.
Yeah.
For quite some time.
2010, no.
Yeah.
Overall, we're aging our forests quite rapidly.
Right.
Yeah, because of the low harvest rate that we've got going.
So we might be getting more sequestration than
Should be,
emissions.
yeah, definitely.
Right, excellent. Well, and then just moving on to a quick brainstorm of adaptation measures. I mean, how do we deal with potentially drier conditions and more hot days? What would that look like for folks?
Make a comment on that. I think there's a lot of builders and buildings on the island that a lot of the newer buildings are being built with fire resistance in mind. A lot of older buildings, people are slowly renovating their buildings to have fire resistance in mind. Of course, every renovation brings more materials from off island, and steel or replacement insulation, etc. But the energy efficiency that also comes with renovating the buildings is huge too, because we burn less firewood and less energy to heat the buildings or cool the buildings. And that's the other advantage of fireproofing a roof is you can add more insulation so it's cool in the summers during heat waves. and more fire resistance, and that's I think, an easy, or not an easy, but an effective win to renovate, lower budget buildings, but make them effectively cooler in the summer, warmer in the winter, and more fire resistant is a good thing overall.
Well, and like everything that's going on with the fire hall, and then bringing in all the measures of the big tanks and everything for fire, and giving the rebates for home sprinkler systems and all of that kind of stuff too, so.
Super interesting to notice, yeah, the opportunities to combine adaptation with mitigation. Heat pumps also, people like the combo deal there. Yeah, but also good to note that a lot of the things that we might also choose require some upfront emissions or impacts in various ways. Yeah. I think people are thinking about like, less moisture impact on agriculture, and like, our community is doing some investigation into our aquifers and recharge rates and supply, so certainly some concerns there, and people know that water and farmers struggling with too much water some seasons and not enough other seasons. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Perfect. All right. Well, yeah, if you have more ideas to add, please, I'll say maybe email Max and we can capture even more ideas if they're coming to people later. And I will move on here. I really appreciate folks sticking around. Now I know Max wanted to present part of this slide. Just kind of to conclude, want to ask folks to think about something that you would like to act on, kind of related to mitigation or adaptation in the future. I just invite you to kind of reflect on your experience in this workshop. I see a hand over there.
Yeah, hi folks. I'm gonna say goodnight to you all and thank you so darn much for all the good thoughts and good work and heart. And I guess I'd just leave us with my opinion that the bottom line is that I think we need to ask for less of the earth. We need to all scale back just a little bit, actually a whole lot, and just be grateful for what we have and stay home and grow food and look after our neighbors. Okay, and a lot of the problem would actually go away if we would do that on a large scale. So I don't believe that the answer is tech and numbers and computers. It helps. It helps. It's all good. I don't mean to belittle it, but the bottom line is our own human approach, our attitude, our heart. And we need to change. We need to remember how to love this earth again and treat her with tenderness and nurture everything. So that's what needs to change, actually. That's the bottom line for me. Just thought I'd say goodnight. I love you guys.
Thank you.
Yes, and that's so much what the conclusion a lot of us come to. See, thank you for expressing it so well.
This seems like a good segue for my observations and something I'd like to share. First off, I mean, in terms of how I feel about this, it's great knowledge and also pretty daunting, overwhelming. But continuing to be the optimist that I am, and then just piggybacking on what Cece was just saying, the reality is that we're human beings, and I know that sounds pretty obvious, but if you look at our behavior, I think that we need to acknowledge and recognize that we don't embrace solutions that we can't act on. So no matter how much education we have, unless we think we're actually capable of stepping up to the line, we come up with all kinds of justifications for why we can't or shouldn't. Look at south of the border, you know, you gotta do this, like half that population believes all the garbage that comes out of Donald Trump's mouth. So tools that help flip that equation, I think, are essential. And I discovered a little over 10 years ago, financing tool that, I'm not selling it here, but I'm trying to sort of bring people's awareness up about it. That's being used in the States, and it's essentially, it eliminates the financial barrier. Because the way it works is, I'll just tell you very quickly, you can borrow up front all the money you need to upgrade your building and your infrastructure. And you repay it through your taxes, 100%. With no money down up front, no grants or subsidies required. And 100% is repaid through your property taxes over up to 30 years. So you can really stretch payments out and make it affordable. And so that eliminates the financial barrier. But then there's one other piece that goes with that, which is that once you eliminate the financial barrier, the private sector is incentivized to actually go out and knock on doors and sell sustainability measures and energy efficiency measures, because there isn't an economic barrier they have to overcome. So now they're motivated to actually get out and pound on doors and sell their services and sell their products. The main point, though, is that once you, and I was looking at the numbers for buildings, and it's quite small. For example, it's like 2, 3, 5%, whatever, for Cortes especially. But there's a psychological aspect to this. If you convert your house and you are now net zero or near net zero, or maybe even, you know, rejuvenate, I think your mental calculus flips and you become an energy champion. Whereas before you might have been, oh, what can we do or whatever, but you've done something now. And because you've done something, you're now more incentivized to actually step up and go, oh, there's more that I can do. So I think that there's these models, I don't think, take into account the domino effect that something like that would have. So even though the building sector is relatively small, the PACE program, it's Property Assessed Clean Energy is the name of the program. Anyways, anybody who's interested, you can look up paceb.ca, or that's the only website I've got working right now. But there's more information about it.
Is it in the States? Where is it happening?
It's right across the States. There's two programs. There's a commercial program, which is basically everything other than single family homes. And then there's a single family home program. The biggest barrier to it isn't uptake on the part of the private sector or financial institutions or whatever. It's politicians. Because their advisors look at this and go, oh, it's not a policy that requires the government to do any grants or subsidies or anything else. All they have to do is adopt legislation. So, well, and there's ironically, there's people in the sustainability consulting sector who are not in favor of it as well, because they would be out of jobs. I think they're wrong in that. Anyways, I just wanted to sort of, address that.
You really understood what you were saying there.
Yeah, so if you want more information, go to paceb.ca. Because I was from Alberta initially, so that's where I set the thing up with a group of other people. We're still working on it. We actually, I'll just close by saying, we actually got the Alberta government to adopt a PACE program. it's a very underperforming PACE program, I'll have to say, because they put so many constraints and arbitraries on it, whatever. But it's still there, it's better than nothing. And BC unfortunately started to go down this road, and then they engaged a consulting firm who did a report, and they didn't like the results, so they shelved the report, and that was the end of the story.
Oh, so BC doesn't have it.
You know,
Oh.
not yet, but if we wanted to act on this, we could get on that bandwagon, and it enables people. Anyways,
My
I
cousin-
dominated the platform.
No, that was a really good point, well brought up.
No, you're welcome.
My cousin has started quite a few social enterprise programs in Manitoba,
Yeah,
and they've been replicated and scaled in other provinces too. And one of his first issues was, you know, we signed up for BC Hydro, we did not pay any upfront costs, you only had solar panels, you got all these upfront costs.
right,
So he did just as an example, one of the programs is Active Energy.
yeah,
So it's geothermal, which is a really good thing in Manitoba because it's just below the ground, but he's an economist, so everything he's looking at is gonna be cheaper as well.
right,
He likes to hit climate change, poverty and recidivism always too. He's always involved in something to these folks that we work.
yeah,
But the Aki Energy thing, they've done many projects. And I'm not, well, I know that at one point, the government kind of shout on it because, wait a minute, all these upfront costs, but the amortization is paying it with smaller bills than what the people had before,
exactly,
right?
yeah,
And there, it's economic, it works, but,
right,
you know, when he first was looking for somebody, because he doesn't install these things, he was looking for somebody in the geothermal world to do this. And, the first few people we tackled said, well, I'm not gonna train a cohort to do that, we were doing them on reserves. And because that would be competition, and Sean's like, well, what do you get about global warming? And then he found somebody who went, oh, absolutely, I would train a cohort. And so the first project, they trained up a bunch of folks on this reserve that didn't have work and to become geothermal installers. And once the reserve was done, they started doing it off reserve. Within a year, they bought their first piece of equipment, like it was a very viable business. And it really works there.
that's great,
He couldn't do it right in the city, but he did his own house, and to drill straight down on the city lot is too expensive. That wasn't economically viable. But anywhere in the country where they can go so far and entrench, yes.
yeah, you can go horizontal.
Yeah, I mean, I love talking to him, like, he has books, I'll share the books with you, but, you know, he's always about these programs should make the conservatives and the liberals happy. Because we're solving the problems and we're costing less money.
Exactly.
It's like win-win.
That's right.
It's not political that way, it should, and so he tries very hard to not, I mean, he used to be in the NGO government in Manitoba, but he tries hard not to align that way.
Right,
To go, this is for everybody, this is important.
These are very interesting initiatives everyone's raising. It's very, very cool to hear this. Thank you.
Sean Loney, Aki Energy is a good way to do
That's awesome. Yeah, one of the ways that I think people talk about some of that is like social tipping point. So like we get some momentum going in the right direction, we get the incentives aligned, and then a lot more is achievable a lot faster.
Apparently, if there's a few solar panels in a neighborhood, more start to appear.
Right,
Just seeing them increases the number.
yeah, they correlated that with
Yeah.
like visual line of sight. And you can't see from your house the solar panel, but it doesn't have the impact even if it's
Yeah.
closer than.
yeah,
Right,
Yeah.
right.
That's amazing research.
Well, I have to excuse myself and thank you,
Yeah.
Christine, and thank you, Max, for putting on a great
Yeah.
presentation.
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christine, thank you.
Thanks.
Coming.
Yeah, I really appreciate everyone's time.
Presentation for participants.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hope you have a great evening.
See you.